Okay, so for the final time today, we've got to do this all again tomorrow. I am joined by Mathew and Ellie from Hydrock, and we're going to be exploring the importance of decarbonisation and reaching net zero, but also understanding a bit more about social value. We mentioned earlier on when we had, seems like an eternity ago now, when we had Amelia on, that actually social value is something that can often be forgotten. So it's great to have you here. So, Mathew, just in terms of the current market trends in net zero, um, how do we define that? And what is the definition in terms of a journey towards net zero? And could you just elaborate a bit more in terms of the work that you're doing with us here at Speedy?
No, I appreciate that question. And the journey is the right way to deem this with regards to net zero. It's something that we can't achieve today. It's something we've got to look forward to 2030, 2040. And if we take a step back and look at the UK's policies, we've all got to commit to a net zero target by 2050. That's in policies. But if we start looking at key players in this built environment, such as national highways, HS2, Network Rail, they have their net zero ambitions quite public. And suppliers such as Speedy, contractors like tier one contractors, have to adhere to those net zero goals. They have to deliver that journey and build resilience into carbon management systems. We've also got, in terms of policy, the requirement to have a public procurement note, which is called PPN 0621, which is a carbon reduction plan, which forces companies to really benchmark their emissions and disclose initiatives. So there's a real drive for that 1.5 degree. I still remain hopeful that
Yeah.
we'll hit it, even though I turned the TV on yesterday on the news and it was all doom and gloom. But I'm still hopeful that we'll get to that close to that 1.5 degree and achieve net zero. And the work that we do with Speedy is really important. Um, I I think Speedy's at the forefront in the hire market with regards to its net zero ambitions, supported by the Decade to Deliver strategy, which is recognised now within the industry as a leading strategy. And you've got fantastic investment into EVs and biofuels and so on. And Hydrock supports that. You know, at Hydrock, we've been supporting your Decade to Deliver strategy. We will continue to do that and support customers on their own strategies as well. So there's a real, you know, as it goes back to the first thing you said, it's a journey and we're all on that journey.
I think, and this may be sort of, stripping it back to, the very basics, but there will be some people sort of tuning in or catching up on this afterwards on social media. And I think this is often a question that, I sometimes not, I don't hear being asked, but I think this is really important. But why is net zero important? If you just strip it back, but if we cut, beyond the Decade to Deliver strategy, all the stuff you just mentioned, why ultimately is that important?
I think if you look at the built environment, predominantly where Speedy works and a lot of the companies here today is that the built environment's treated as a, should we say, we're building something, we're polluting, we're having an impact on the environment. That why net zero matters. We want to, actually do something positive, have that journey towards net zero, dampen the impacts that we have in building projects, building buildings, the likes of new infrastructure and so on. And net zero is really important to drive that reduction in impact. And now net zero has become a bit of a work winner. If we look at why does it matter to some of the companies out here today, is it's actually a work winner now. Within tender requirements, the requirements of Speedy and the requirements of their customers, looking at net zero, committing to net zero, it now wins you work. And there is huge £1 million tenders out there right now which have a certain requirement around social value and carbon. So actually caring about net zero is going to provide that return on investment.
So to cut back then, really, so what are the requirements for organisations like Speedy, our supply chain partners as well? What are the requirements to work towards net zero for large tier one contractors, for example?
That's a great question because Speedy's been on this journey for a number of years now. The Decade to Deliver is a fantastic strategy, as I've said, and you've taken many years to get there. You've got certain disclosures like TCFD and CDP, and these disclosures that are now mandatory for a large organization such as yourself. When we're talking about large organizations here, there's certain mandatory requirements that you have to deliver on around climate change, declaring net zero, certain PLC requirements. Now, if we look at where the movement's coming now, it's working with those SMEs to now get them on that journey as well and bring them along with you, whether it's education, whether it's upskilling as well. And that's really now the requirement for Speedy in the Decade to Deliver, is now educating its supply chain to bring them along that journey. And there is contracts out there within Speedy supply chain that's now mandating science-based targets, which is a fantastic initiative that's pushing our supply chain forward. So as I say, Speedy's doing a fantastic, I'd say industry-leading approach. It's taken a number of years to get there and a lot of effort by the teams in-house. And the supply chain should get on board with that. We've spoke to a lot of suppliers today, and we've said, right, this is your step, this is your first step. Okay, it's understanding what is net zero for you, what are your objectives. Speedy went through that journey a number of years ago, and the thing is that Speedy has that support. If a supplier does need to have a conversation with them and have that learning, they're there to support that. So I think to answer the question is that Speedy itself has got to where it is through the mandatory disclosures and the requirements. It's now up to the supply chain to follow through.
And I think it's a really important point that you make. And I think if we just look back to the panel discussion that we had previously with Asif, Philip, and Tom, the reason we pulled that together is because we wanted to sort of examine the importance of value ESG through the supply chain. Right from manufacturer to ourselves to the customer. And I think that's a really important point you make, that and they sort of elaborated on the fact that we do work collaboratively, not just to come up with new products, but ultimately when it comes to things like sustainability and ESG and removing carbon from the supply chain, we actually do that with our partners anyway.
Yeah.
So Tilly, you are very much on the social value side of Hydrock. I guess social value is I think people might think they know what it means, but ultimately it's one of those things I think that is relatively new to organisations. Could you just elaborate and I guess give us a bit of a definition of what social value really means and what it is?
Sure. I mean, it doesn't have a legal definition, which has caused a lot of issues in terms of people responding to it. So different organizations will use different definitions depending on what it means to them. Although, previously people thought of sort of corporate social responsibility, social value, social impact, the S in ESG. In theory, these can all be interchanging definitions, but it is effectively the value that businesses can add to society. Specifically, how you might, in a quantifiable measure.
Definitely, and I think that's generally when you speak to people about social value, it is that is a sort of general area. But I think you touched on the fact that there is no definition of it. What do you think the benefits would be of sort of creating something that is perhaps backed up in statute, that would give it that sort of focus alongside an equal importance of ESG?
Yeah, I think the government has tried to do this. So in 2012, we have the Social Value Act came in place. And then Mathew mentioned earlier about procurement notes. So PPN 0620 is the procurement note relevant to social value. And of course, the social value model that those two acts are based around gives a certain framework and certain pillars that social value sits on. So, the themes that it counts under, we do have a sort of groundwork to work on. We just don't have that kind of legal definition. Yeah.
So I think one of the things, and I think as you said, it hasn't just sort of snuck up on us, but I think, for things like the Social Value Act that you mentioned, I think perhaps have been missed on the radar by those who would generally be interested. But I think over the past few months, we have seen a sudden sort of interest in it. What has driven that, and where has that came from?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many business drivers for it. The procurement note is relevant to public procurement, but we are now starting to see it in private procurement also, where it mandates that 10% weighting of those procurement, is weighted on social value. That's an enormous amount, and that's 10% a minimum. It could be more than that. Where it's asking businesses to make firm commitments, where previously, social value did used to be, I think, a nice to have, and it's now become business critical. So from that, the tender and client point of view, that's one major business driver. Also from investors, and another one is from talent as well. We talk typically about sort of Gen Z and what they want to see from the workplace, and actually, this is a generation that really cares about the companies that they work for. And if it's not a company that's doing good, then they're going to be less interested. So from sort of those really key three stakeholders, there are business drivers. So that's why we're seeing a lot more prominence and people talking about social value a huge amount.
And it's obviously great to see that companies are sort of, talking about it more actively for a number of reasons which you've highlighted. Mathew, I think we sort of introduced this session by sort of looking at the sort of esoteric side of ESG, the sort of academic discussion around it. But ultimately, I think where I want to go next with this is sort of understanding what net zero is in practice. So ultimately, what is a carbon footprint? People talk about that all the time. We hear it, if we switch on the radio, if we listen to a podcast. Can you just sort of set out the definition of that?
Again, this is part of the opportunity for Speedy to educate its suppliers that this may be a new term. So what is a carbon footprint? And we can break that down into scoped emissions, and there's various requirements out there and standards out there. But you can look at what is your direct emissions, so what you can control. So that's looking at your operations, whether it's your electricity use, what gas you're procuring, what your vans, should we say some of the vans and the vehicles here, for instance, what can you directly control? And then we look at what indirectly, is part of your supply chain, for instance. So all the purchased goods and services that you deliver on. And supply chain, the larger the amount of your emissions are actually in the supply chain. Speedy has about 94 to 96% of its emissions within the supply chain. I think it's really important that companies here today, if they could take anything away from me yapping on about net zero, is to start looking at what is their carbon footprint in these scoped emissions and what is their direct and indirect carbon footprints. And there's various modeling that you can do and various quantification, but it's that first step. It's benchmarking where you're at. That's the first stage of the journey to net zero. So carbon footprint, it might sound scary, but it's a real... I won't say it's easy because I've been doing this for 9 years now, but essentially it's something that's manageable, and you've got to benchmark where you're at now to then look at where you should be to deliver on net zero.
I think like anything like this, taking the first steps is the most important thing. To sort of coin one of our phrases, we get it done. If I was a company, say starting up today, or if I was, in a business that was established, but we'd not yet embarked on that ESG journey, where would you start from?
And we've had some of those questions raised today at our stand, and I think it's really important that the first step is that benchmarking, understanding what is your carbon footprint, that understanding, what your scoped emissions are. And the next thing is educating your employees, your leadership team. I work with multiple companies that the best thing they've done is get their directors, their managing directors bought into the net zero narrative to drive down decarbonisation. It makes life so much easier, should we say. And then once you've got your once you've got your carbon footprint, you've educated, you now need to look at your targets. What are you going to commit to? I wouldn't recommend anyone commit to net zero by, next year, for instance. But what is measurable and manageable as well? And obviously, finance needs to be part of that. What funding and, requirements around funding and resources you're going to need to deliver on. And then it's really the meat on the bones of a strategy, which is around implementing decarbonisation measures. And I could talk all day, and I know it's late in the day, about decarbonisation measures. But that's looking at systems, data, that's looking at, transition to EV or hydrogen, HVO, all these things that have been discussed and showcased today, these decarbonisation measures. That's the real meat on the bones. And Speedy is going through that right now. Speedy is doing fantastic decarbonisation across its supply chain. Nearly a 46% reduction in its scope 1 and 2 since the baseline in 2019. And that's, they've got a target of 50% reduction by 2025. So they're nearly on that target. And there's been significant investment there. Once that real decarbonisation has happened, you can then start reporting it. This is where, there's potential work winning opportunities and marketing and so on, and disclosures as well. And there's been a couple of questions today posed to us around offsetting. And I'm not going to say offsetting it shouldn't happen. It's certainly got its place in the world of net zero, but it should always be a last resort. You should look at what you can decarbonise within your control and that journey before looking at offsetting as that last resort.
I think it's a really good point in the way I think that it's sort of, you position this in sort of understanding where you're at the moment and doing things that, you can practically do to sort of reduce those emissions, and actually taking that approach of a whole business. Because the earlier conversation that we had with Amelia and Julia from Mott MacDonald, they made that absolutely clear that that's important. So I think for anyone that's been sort of watching these discussions all day, it's been a sort of real theme to make it whole business. One of the things, particularly around ESG, that I think, certainly we as a business, and myself as, someone that works within the Speedy Hire marketing team, we've always considered ESG and sustainability to be an issue for our sort of larger customers. So, sure, some of them are here today, the likes of your Amcos, your Balfour Beatties, aggregate industries and so on. But when it comes to things like, and when these things become sort of work-winning type deals, actually what's really important is that we sort of can educate and lead the whole of the supply chain. So ultimately those sort of smaller customers, those trade types, those SMEs, who actually might not have the resource of having someone who is an ESG focused person in their business alone. What advice and what would you suggest to these sort of smaller companies who are now being asked more, their customers are asking more of them to help contribute towards their reduction in carbon emissions? What would you suggest to them?
I'd say that, one, you're not alone. There is plenty of small, even large companies starting the journey. But there's also a lot of resource out there. The industry's got to a stage where there is, for instance, the Supply Chain Sustainability Score, a fantastic free resource for any business who wants to educate its employees, its leadership teams around what is net zero, what can they do around quantifying a carbon footprint to decarbonisation as well. And there's those, industry organisations out there that provide free resource. There's another one, the Carbon Literacy Programme as well, that provides training. That is a paid service, but again, those organisations are out there. So, the two things I'd say is, one, you're not alone. Don't think that you're on this journey alone. And two, there is a lot of resource out there. But, let's say Speedy is a fantastic resource. They've got an industry-leading strategy. They've got an ESG team that is more than happy to engage with suppliers, engage with customers as well. We've got to realise that some of Speedy's customers have started this journey as well, and Speedy is, can support them in educating them. So there's an opportunity to reach out to Speedy's ESG team to provide that support, upskilling, an opportunity as well.
Towards their social value requirements.
Yeah.
So, support a larger business offering their knowledge sharing with an SME or a VCSE actually is social value in itself. And I'll add to what Matthew was saying on the previous question, how should they start out across the wider ESG space, not just emissions, is with a materiality assessment. Thinking about, as a business, and this is something that you don't need, you don't need necessarily a huge amount of resources for, to actually sit down and think what is material to us as a business under the banner of ESG is huge amount of different things, and frankly you can't do it all. So thinking about what is truly material to us, what can we affect, what is up within our scope, and then determining a strategy that's based around those few things. Yeah.
I think it's a really important point, because we're not just there to sort of support was larger customers on their journey, but as you say, that education element around how we engage and inform the whole of a supply chain is critical for us as well. I mean, just to come back to sort of putting social value into practice now. I mean, what would you say, and what have you discovered are the sort of most common business challenges in responding to social value?
I think one of the largest challenges is the procurement piece and responding to social value in procurement, and then by extension the kind of wider corporate strategy piece. Working out, well, what are we allowed to commit to in these tender pieces? What are our focus areas? And then how do we go about measuring and monitoring the commitments that we've made on a contract by contract basis? There's a real challenge in that, because you're kind of measuring the unmeasurable, but it is measurable, I can assure you. And just because something's really hard to measure doesn't mean it doesn't have value and that it's not worth measuring.
Just to push you a bit more on that.
Yeah.
How would you measure social value? What would you say? What would be the sort of top two or three sort of pieces of advice that you would give to someone who wants to quantify, I guess, what social value means for their business?
Yeah, I mean, depending on exactly what within the scope of social value you're trying to measure, there are measuring frameworks out there that you can buy. There are some that are available for free, such as the National TOMS framework. Where in terms of what you're inputting, what you're doing, what your outcomes are for a certain activity, it will offer you a proxy financial value, and then you can effectively total up the social value that you're generating. Or there are much more resource-heavy methods, such as social return on investment assessments, but actually they look at really what the well-defined outcomes are of a specific service. So, for example, if I was to offer you some careers advice, like I might offer, to a school, actually, I've still done an hour of my time, so does that count? Even though you probably didn't need that advice, whereas someone else might have. So I would only find out the kind of true outcome of the value of my input by speaking with you, and actually that stakeholder engagement to understand, what has value and what doesn't, and that depends on your stakeholders and, a whole vast variety of things.
So I think one of the things I think that always helps sort of paint a picture, in a bit more user-friendly way, is giving some examples of when you've seen sort of social value in action. Can you give any sort of examples, whether it be with clients that you work with, and ultimately, what does a good standard of social value practice look like?
So for social value to be really meaningful, you need to take a needs-based and a place-based approach. That means looking at what is needed here, to take effect. So, for example, if I was, Hydrock primarily was an engineering company. If we were to go into a school and think, right, we'll do some STEM engagement, because that's probably what they need. But actually, when we spoke to that school, it turned out that their attendance was really low, and it was because the young people couldn't afford the right uniform or even shoes to get to school.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a totally different problem than the one we were coming in to fill.
Yeah.
But by doing that kind of needs analysis and that place base, we found out that there was a whole other issue which we can help with, and we help solve. So if you're looking at a corporate level, for example, you might say, okay, well, for example, the talk that happened this morning, Women in Construction, we want to, boost the number of women in our business. How do we do that? Okay, well, that's our need. We might speak to some of those women, and we find that there are actually a fair few women in the business, but they're just not getting to those really senior positions. Okay, what can we do to address that need? And in a certain example, we would look at a women in leadership, like a training program, to really get women to the next issue. So you can see you take the need, and then you make an approach specifically designed to do that. I could have gone straight away and tried to address my recruitment practices and stuff like that, and realized that that's actually not where the need was. So that would be, the real formula to what good looks like. It's place-based, needs analysis, and then a well-defined, mechanism to reach that.
So then, looking at that from a Speedy perspective, I mean, you're obviously supporting us with our, with our social value contribution. What would you say, or what would you be guiding us on, or what are you guiding us on to improve? So by the time we sit down again next year, what will we have achieved?
So again, it's particularly on that kind of the bids and in the tender. So for example, if you were to be looking to win some work with a specific local authority, let's say, we have a place, right? Because they're a specific county council, let's say. We would be looking, okay, what are the challenges that that county is facing to boost, and what can Speedy do to support them on their social value approach? We would then design you a tender response that meets that criteria that ultimately would be work winning, hopefully, and has been. Proud to say.
Yeah, no, and it's good to hear that we've got a practical success story of where where we have added value, and I think it's a really good example of the importance of having a proper and robust social value plan which supports your commercial outcomes as well. Mathew, just to sort of come back on, and I know you've been sort of instrumental in sort of driving our sort of net zero agenda and supporting us with that. What have we been asked by our customers to do, particularly when coming up with our own sort of net zero plans?
And we've seen a real transition in what the customer is asking. Originally, customers have just wanted data. They've just wanted to know their carbon, value from say, the generators or equipment that is on site. And generally that's what the contracts have been formed on, from, years ago in these certain frameworks. Now we're actually seeing that customers want to understand that carbon footprint, for instance. They want to drive efficiencies, decarbonisation, return on investments. They want to see the pounds that they save based on the eco alternatives, and we see loads of eco alternatives today. So that is now a transition of what Speedy's been asked, and it's really important that we address that and work collaboratively with the customers to get that report on not only the carbon value, the bare minimum data, but give them a level of decarbonisation solutions, management systems to support them. There's fantastic dashboards within Speedy to give you numbers, but then Speedy now gives something on top of that, a level of intelligence as well to drive down that carbon value. And then if we look at group level, if we look at Speedy as a group within the decade to deliver, customers like, eventually National Highways, for instance, as an asset owner, and Speedy works with a lot of those tier one contractors on national highway schemes, they're going to want to know about PAS 2080. They want Speedy to adopt PAS 2080, which is a carbon management system, essentially, that will support decarbonisation, the drive to net zero. They will want Speedies who have annual audits around their greenhouse gases. They're now coming into play, so there's two ways to look at it. There's customers who want Speedy at group level to drive certain management systems and approaches. But then on the contracts, the projects specifics, they want Speedy to report on data. They also want the latest innovation and eco products. And there's a real opportunity for Speedy to find those change makers out there. Those customers who want to be a change maker. They want to drive decarbonisation. They're willing to put money to innovation trials. We've seen some fantastic innovation today, like hydrogen units or clean air gas engines and stuff like that. Those need trialing. Those need funding to get onto site. And this is what Speedy can work with customers and collaborate on to start that engagement and get them onto site.
I think in terms of, one of the reasons why we obviously have this sort of event is the fact that it puts Speedy, our customers, and our supply chain partners in the same room at the same time, so we can discuss collaboration. And I've no doubt today that some of our sort of customers and our supply chain colleagues will have been having those conversations to aid our suppliers in their innovation as well. So one of the things you touched on earlier on was data, and how sort of traditionally the sort of approach has been from our customers is wanting to understand what their carbon footprint and outputs look like from the kit that they hire from us. But I guess my question is, it's sort of going one step beyond that. It's sort of understanding why is data important, but more importantly, how does that, I guess, help the industry tackle one of the big issues like greenwashing that I think we see quite a lot of? So, I guess, why is data important?
There's two ways. I spoke about this at the Net Zero Live event that we had. Is that there's two ways to look at data. There's just data, just doing the what it's there to do is numbers.
Yeah.
But then there's purpose-led data, data that has an objective. That could be to support decarbonisation. That could be to support, the opportunity to add eco options. And that's where Speedy's now transitioned from just getting data into the system, and Speedy has lakes of information around, greenhouse gas emissions of certain equipment. But now we want purpose-led data. What is this data's objective? Is it to drive the eco opportunities? Is there to benchmark, for instance? I think companies have got to understand that the data is now a bare minimum. That you have to provide this information to the likes of Speedy, to the likes of the market. They've got to provide what's your emissions, and that could be what's your fuel use, for instance. As say you're running a bit of equipment per hour, what's your fuel use based on efficiency and load? But we want to go one step further. We want to look at greenhouse gas emissions and how can we make that product more efficient? Can we educate the users, for instance? I think that the funny term that we always have is this project manager, whoever he or she is on site, turning off the eco generators, for instance. But we've got to educate the masses to efficiently use these products. I think that's where that purpose comes in. And if there's any message to come out today to the suppliers here is get that data in, start understanding that data, and start clearly reporting it to the likes of Speedy and working with them on that purpose.
And I think that is what we want our supply chain partners to take away. We are a business that thrives on collaboration, and hopefully then that allows our suppliers to go away and innovate, because it's conversations that start at an early stage like this that allows them to bring out the hydrogen electric booms of the future, for example. So one of the things, Mathew, just as we sort of bring this session a close, one of the things you mentioned was the PAS 2080. Could I just get you to elaborate a bit more on that? Just because I think that is one of the things, that we are a player in the highways market, and I'm sure those who are reviewing this, watching it back, will understand a bit more about it. But could I just get you to elaborate a bit more on that, and sort of just to help us understand what that is and what that means?
So PAS 2080 is a standard for managing greenhouse gases at a company level down to project level. It's really a management system, like an environmental management system. And it's been around for a long time, since 2016. And recently, last year, it had a revision. And it has a big play on the highways market now, where National Highways are now putting it into contracts that their major suppliers, whether it's tier 1, tier 2s, and even the likes of Speedy, now have to have third-party certification and deployment of that management system on National Highways projects. And SMEs and micro suppliers on the National Highways supply chain, which a lot of these will be today that we see, will have to start adopting some of the principles of that standard, not get verified, but start adopting and evidencing those principles. And that's just National Highways. We're seeing movement with Network Rail. We're seeing movement, obviously, HS2, Sizewell, Hinkley. These big mega projects, these asset owners are now mandating this standard. It's a real game changer in the industry. And Speedy's on that journey. Fingers crossed, Speedy will be the first hire partner to be PAS 2080 as a supplier, third-party certified this calendar year. So it's going to be a really big push with Speedy to get its management system looking at decarbonisation, looking at leadership, quantification, procurement, continual improvement. The clauses are, quite detailed. And there is support out there, for instance, Hydrock, we give our support, but also Speedy gives its support to its suppliers around the adoption of PAS 2080. So I can't stress this enough, is that if you've not heard of it, you need to read up on it, because you know, National Highways, by 2025, if you've not started doing it, anything around PAS, you won't be able to work for them. It's in the contracts.
But I think the message is loud and clear on that, Ben. If you don't know
Apologies,
what
I'm
it is,
late on a day.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm sure we will be emphasising that to our customers going forward. So just on the final point, and I sort of with Toby from my email earlier on, I asked this. We're obviously heading towards a general election, and what I want to understand is, as you know, social value and ESG professionals, I think first of all, what do you see sort of coming out, you know, in the next few years, and what do you want to see from the parties competing for power? So I appreciate that's quite a broad question, but what would be the big couple of things that you'd like to see from a legislative, you know, perspective? What would you like to see change, or what could you change? Tilly, I don't know if you want to go first. I
incredibly
appreciate
broad.
that as a big question answer, but you know,
no,
around
that's
the
fine, though. I think-
conversations we've had around social value, I think it's important.
Yeah,
to
yeah. I mean,
understand.
in terms of, if you think about the last decade or so, in terms of what we've seen Brexit, we've seen a cost of living crisis, we've seen a pandemic, and the changes that those things have had on society have been enormous, right? And in terms of the struggles that, you know, people are facing. So in the next, you know, looking forwards, I think we want to see change that really, you know, legislative change that really addresses the needs that people are facing today on a place-based approach. So thinking about a cost of living crisis, and it all comes back to sort of the Sustainable Development Goals as well. The first one of which is no poverty, second of which is zero hunger. You know, these are highly social goals. I think people forget that sustainability is, you know, has this whole other social aspect to it. Often gets forgotten about. But yeah, that's really where I'd want to see, you know, change. It would be, you know, I think some changes moving to give sort of, you know, local authorities more power and more spend than they have had, which from a social value point of view, I think can be really positive, because you're going to get that more local approach. So yeah.
Matthew, don't know if there's anything you want to add on that, just in terms of what you'd like to see the priorities come from an ESG perspective.
I strongly believe the UK is a leader in ESG policy and governance. What I'd like to see is a more challenging corporate requirements around ESG. There's various disclosures now. There is some upcoming disclosures. I think there's a new corporate disclosure coming out in July of this year around ESG. So I'd see a little bit more of a tightening and a governance structure around that. Who's auditing, for instance, disclosures? And while you've got the big four, you know, and the accountancy firms, a bit more of a tightening around, you know, are they delivering significant change? I'd also like to see in the, you know, in funding of new innovation and technologies. I was a bit disheartened to see the investment into new coal as well, which the government have expressed. But I want to see that transition to green hydrogen, which has always been a potential silver bullet in the journey to net zero. I know, for instance, Lower Thames Crossing and National Highways are procuring a lot of green hydrogen, but we really need that UK production and the investment in the infrastructure there. We need investment into EV infrastructure and the management and maintenance of that. So I'd like to one, see more corporate governance, and this will impact Speedy as a public company, but also that investment into green infrastructure and green jobs as well. I think, you know, both me and Tilly can vouch is that resource is so constrained on the market right now, and one of the blockers to actually getting where we want to be. So I'd like some investment, if I could ask for anything from the government, is investment into green skills and green jobs to support where we need to be. Right now, we're delivering on what we'd like to be doing right now. We're not looking at that forecast. Where do we need to be in the next decade?
Great. Well, thank you very much for that. I think, first of all, I appreciate that, you know, being the last on the bill on the first day can be a bit of a challenge. But I think we've had a really good conversation. I think we've debated and discussed a lot of important points, and hopefully, those, who have watched or who will be watching back can take away a lot of the really useful insight that you've gave us today. So thank you very much, and thank you for everyone who came along as well. Thank you very
you.
much.
Thank you.